Hi guys. I got a heads up that a popular YouTuber, Mike the Vegan, has published a video on our lean mass hyperresponder study. I'm going to go ahead and do a reaction video, but if it gets long, I may split it into parts.
Hey, it's Mike here, and today, does this new keto report prove that super high LDL does not cause atherosclerosis on a keto diet? We're talking about the preliminary results from the lean mass hyperresponder study where people on a keto diet get super high LDL. I mentioned it briefly in the past, but the results are having people who are on a keto diet, low carb, carnivore diet, whatever, shouting from the rooftops about the findings, with a lot of people now.
Okay, just like a lot of things that were said all at the same time, it's worth emphasizing that we're interested in this research. We're interested in a high level of LDL as resulting from the response, seemingly, of fat adaptation. And it's in this particular group. It's in this particular group that's part of our entry criteria. So, of course, we would not be in favor of any reductionist opinion, either by supporters or detractors alike, in trying to suggest that it's to be applied across all populations, regardless of context. So I think that's important because I feel like a lot of times there's an effort that I think all of us should be making towards steel manning the position of those involved. So just wanted to get that part out of there right away, especially with everything that was said on the front end.
Feeling that it's okay to chug endless amounts of saturated fat and increase your LDL to 500 because it's not gonna do any damage. And speaking of shouting from the rooftops, here is Shawn Baker, carnivore dieter, telling his following to share these results far and wide.
So the data that I've been talking about is finally in. It's this super exciting stuff, something I think is incredibly powerful. You know, this particular set of population, low carb, lean, otherwise metabolically healthy, that it appears that cardiovascular disease is not developing, or not developing at any significant rate at all. So that may give some of you guys that are in this situation some level of relief.
As you can see, all of his carnivore
I feel like that video might have been somewhat edited because I'm going to have to come back and see if I can insert something if I'm right, because I do remember when Shawn released that video, it was shortly after Budoff's presentation, and I think he had a lot of qualifying language that was actually within that video.
So the data that I've been talking about is finally in. It's this super exciting stuff, something I think is incredibly powerful. You know, this particular set of population, low carb, lean, otherwise metabolically healthy, that it appears that cardiovascular disease is not developing, or not developing at any significant rate at all. So that may give some of you guys that are in this situation some level of relief. Right? So what does this mean? Does it mean that you can ignore LDL cholesterol? It doesn't matter. No, it doesn't mean that. And Dr. Budoff, in his 17-minute presentation, says that no, you cannot ignore that. He's still a believer in LDL cholesterol being causal to cardiovascular disease. But what he is saying is that it appears to be, in some instances, you know, this particular set of population, low carb, lean, otherwise metabolically healthy, that it appears that cardiovascular disease is not developing, or not developing at any significant rate at all. So that may give some of you guys that are in this situation some level of relief. You know, his suggestion was, if you have high cholesterol but all the other markers look good, get some sort of an imaging study, maybe get a coronary calcium score, and if it is low or zero, then you're probably pretty good.
Now that I'm done with the edit, I actually like Shawn's answer even better than when I first heard it. He carried a lot of the nuance. He emphasized that there's the specificity of this population. He emphasized the preliminary nature of this data. But on top of that, he brought up Dr. Budoff's position with regard to LDL, and even further, that as an answer to a question Dr. Budoff gave in his original lecture to someone in the audience, that even if somebody does have high LDL, he himself would feel more comfortable if there was further efforts towards getting imaging and to confirm or disconfirm whether or not, for example, they have a 0 CAC, which again I think is actually a very moderate position, because then you're determining whether or not there's existing disease, which is very prognostic towards potential outcome. So while Shawn and I definitely disagree on a number of different things, I thought that this was such a great answer from him. And To be perfectly honest, I'm a little disappointed with the edit because I feel like the edit makes it sound as if he is just more categorically dismissive of LDL as per the this data that was just discussed by Dr. Budoff. So my hope is I can kind of talk more people on all sides into trying to steelman each other's position and to do our best to carry the nuance for each other.
I know some keto dieters will watch this and be like, oh my God, this guy's vegan. Let's just see what stupid stuff he has to say about this. But no, a lot of the criticisms that I'm going to be levying here are by people that are not vegan. They're people that are even more or less in the same camp of low carb. For example, more or less a whistleblower that helped author the study initially, but was then later kicked out over their concerns. Yup, it's going to get juicy. And I will say I want to present lean mass hyperresponder as a concept in a fair way because I believe that people on a vegan keto diet, despite even potentially eating lower saturated fat, metabolically could end up in the same situation. So we should know about it. All right, let's go. Starting out with the basics of lean mass hyperresponders for those that aren't aware. If we call it LMHR, that's what I'm referring to. And this term was originally coined by low-carb dieter Dave Feldman. And this really refers to leaner people with a lower BMI that when they go on a keto diet, their LDL skyrockets, and they actually now have some particular figures for this. They say an LDL cholesterol greater than or equal to 200 milligrams per deciliter, HDL over 80, and triglycerides under 70. And many of these people have an LDL between 500 or 1,000 milligrams per deciliter. And again, the conventional cutoff is 100 for increased risk. Well, saturated fat certainly plays a role here. It appears that we can see people playing with their saturated fat intake and not making much of a difference with their already super high LDL. So in that sense,
so far, I'm really impressed. Mike is actually not only going through our research, but he identifies the case report that it showed how the saturated fat was not, or rather the LDL was not following the saturated fat in this very hypercholesterolemic case report that we published last year. It really emphasized the more of that data at that point, especially at those levels, with of course the natural caveats that it is a case report. But that's so far his review of our literature has been pretty solid.
Somebody who is more lean, has less fat mass, who is a vegan going on a vegan keto diet might be able to get there as well. And the question is, why does this happen? And they have developed a whole theory that has to do with the lipid metabolism of these people, which we'll touch on later on in the video. But first, I do just want to thank the YouTube channel Plant Chompers, Chris in particular, for highlighting this.
Thank you, Chris. This is great. I mean, usually outside of the low carb community, we don't see this level of care taken towards looking and reviewing at the literature. So big shout out to Chris McCaskill of Plant Chompers for helping out Mike the Vegan on this
whole LMHR thing and then interviewing the researchers. But let's just get right into the basics of the report. I say report because we're talking about a presentation on the baseline data from a study that has not been peer-reviewed, hasn't been released. The baseline data was presented by one of the researchers, Dr. Budoff, who is a preventative cardiologist. And just looking at this study, we can see that we've got people who are average age of 55 and average time of keto dieting at 4.7 years. They got 80 people that are keto dieters, and then they matched them to 80 people in the Miami Heart Study. Sort of a loose match, but they tried to do the best they could. And the results that have everybody jumping out their seat is that these keto dieters with the higher LDL don't have a statistically significant higher amount of plaque in their arteries compared to the control. And
there was no difference between these two groups. As a matter of fact, the area under the curve was identical.
Okay, now this is where it's time to unleash some criticism, which is probably going to make some people kind of annoyed, but the truth is that the keto community in general is just putting this out completely in a positive light from what I've seen. So it's my job as somebody who's not invested in that diet tribe to say, here's what's wrong with it. First of all, there's several problems with the way they matched these groups. First of all, they didn't match things like physical activity or BMI. The BMI is statistically significant so that the
to be sure, and let me actually put that back up real quick. I think it's absolutely valid to bring up the body mass being different, the BMI. Ours being at 22.5, Miami Heart being at 25.8. But to be fair, this is literally the very lipid energy model that Mike was mentioning from earlier. We make the case that that lower level of mass is part of the reason, especially adipose mass, as to why there is this quote-unquote hyper response. But that said, I would say that those in the Miami Heart Group, even if they have a BMI of 25.8, that's just barely above the BMI cutoff of 25.8 without knowing what their muscle mass and fat mass is. I would certainly speculate that they have a greater overall muscle mass proportionally compared to the general population, given all of the other metrics you see in the means, such as the triglycerides being 96, the HDL being 63, blood pressure, HSRP, A1C being at 5.5. They're generally a fairly healthy group. So I more say this not because I don't think it's valid to bring it up, just that what you may think of when you think of overweight is probably not what these people in the My Heart column actually are. Besides that, it's actually extraordinarily matched, save, of course, the variable of interest being the LDL cholesterol.
Control group averages overweight, and the lean keto people don't. And of course, we're going to talk a lot about the time scale of the study, but first let's touch on that physical activity matching completely lacking here. And the Miami Heart Study did have this exercise data, and they could have easily gotten it from the LMHR people, so sketchy. It's very likely that we...
Whoa, hold it. I definitely push back on whether or not it would be sketchy. First of all, the physical activity being available in the Miami Heart data set is interesting. It's not what we were collecting a priori in the lean mass hyperresponder study. I would absolutely be interested in it. I'd be interested in getting all the data that we could from our group, but we have what we determine at the beginning of the study to be endpoints of interest and to be eligibility criteria. And the actual fitness metrics were not part of either one. It would look more sketchy for us to post hoc determine that we wanted this additional metric and then wrap it in to be part of the matching criteria. Like, imagine if that's literally what we were telling you now. So we said, oh, well, given the data that we had on hand, we decided we wanted to go get some additional data from our cohort. Oh, and now that we've got it, now we're doing the match with Miami Heart, and these results look however they look, whether they support, especially if they support our position. So again, I'm certainly interested in all of these data as they come, but to say that'd be sketchy to not have acquired something when you've already determined what the criteria was a priori, I would argue it's definitely the reverse of that.
We have a healthy user bias here. I mean, keto and CrossFit, two sides of the same coin here. And of course, being less sedentary and having exercise is going to decrease the amount of plaque that they likely had, especially their whole life before that 4 years. Multiple studies show that...
Okay. I have to make two more comments. I hope I'm not interrupting too much, but the first comment I absolutely have to make is that I can't help but appreciate that there's an interest in healthy user bias, period. Because it's definitely one that I've been somewhat critical of existing nutrition studies overall. And usually it's regularly pushed back that healthy user bias is not that significant, or rather that it's well controlled for with things like sensitivity analyses. Sorry to get a bit geeky, but for general users, people who are listening to this channel who may not be as much into statistics, and by no means am I, a biostatistician myself, the concept of healthy user bias is a very valid one to pursue, and especially can come up with observational data. But that said, healthy user bias is usually something for which there's specific instruction that the population of interest is running counter of. If anything, our population is highly likely to have all kinds of points against it on healthy user bias given their existing diet. They're eating a diet high in red meat, typically high in animal protein, typically high in saturated fat, typically low in fiber, all of these different things for which that would be considered independently a cardiovascular disease risk, given existing epidemiological studies that attempt to control for healthy user bias that I don't share that same level of confidence that they succeed at doing. So the reason I bring this up, the reason I have to pause, is I just hope that everybody who's watching Mike's video, who's watching my video, they're very interested in the consistency of the application of these standards. So is our study being held to the same standards as the person who's the source of information who you're listening to at any given time? Or are there different standards based on what the outcomes are? Again, I think that this is always an important thing to bear in mind for science, period. So just had to fit that one in there real quick. Okay, sure enough, it is going to have to be broken up into multiple parts, so this will be the end of part 1. It's a bit late already, and I need to head to sleep soon, and I have a bunch of meetings in the morning tomorrow. But if I can get some time tomorrow, I'll continue on and edit together more for a second part. Hopefully there's only 2 parts total, but we'll see. We'll have to get into more of what gets reviewed, especially with the literature that's coming up. But that said, always interested in keeping the dialogue productive. And I want to leave this on a positive note. I, again, want to appreciate that for whatever pushback I've given that I didn't feel was as much Steelman-ish. Mike did a fairly decent job of covering our existing published work, including the reference of the lean mass hyperresponder phenotype and some overview on the lipid energy model. So thanks again, and hope to catch you guys again soon.